Good evening. Good evening. Oh, I'm sitting way up close today. Hi. Can't move any further back. Whoa. Hi, my name is Yaniv Segal, and I'm the the acting assistant conductor of the Detroit Symphony, and it's great to see you here, and thank you for coming early. I hope it's on purpose. So, I thought I'd talk, I'll talk about the music today, for a change. And this program is, I think, really fun. And I always like to start with a little poll. So we're going to start at the end of the program with Dvořák 8. I imagine most of you have heard Dvořák 8 in concert hall. Yes? No? Maybe? Yes? Yes? No? Did I hear a no? Oh, awesome. It's a fun piece, so you're going to like it. It's one of those pieces that we, in the music world, come up against, or come many times. We start playing it in youth orchestras, in colleges, and on the symphony hall. So it's a favorite and a standard kind of piece for us. And then the Tchaikovsky piano concerto. Today we got the second piano concerto. Has anybody here ever heard the second piano concerto? A couple people, and you came back. All right. Tchaikovsky's not bad. All right. How about the first piece? William Walton, music from Henry V. Yes. Heard it in the symphony hall? No. In the movie? No. Okay, good, because the movie's like 1943, so. All right, so good. So I'll start out with talking a little bit about the Walton, I think, because today is, of course, May 4th. Which, for those people who are fans of another somewhat known movies series of Star Wars, May the 4th be with you, is today. Yeah, groan. So actually earlier today, the orchestra did play a family concert of all Star Wars music, which was appreciated, I'm sure, by many young people in the audience. And I think it's interesting to look at a film score from 1943 and then the film scores that we're used to today and to see how things have evolved. So the music for what's kind of the opening piece or the overture are 5 scenes of music taken from and arranged from William Walton's score to Henry V, which was a film adaptation of the Shakespeare work. So I think about, the history plays of Shakespeare. Basically, they're the equivalent of biopics today. And the music is, just like today, the music serves a couple purposes. In film music, you can have underscoring, you can have overture or credit music, end credit, you can have transition material, you can have something that completely sets the scene. I once saw a really cool project about film music that had the opening scene from the Vietnam epic Platoon. Thank you. No, not Platoon. The other one. Apocalypse Now. Yes, the helicopter scene, right? That opens it up with the of course, the Ride of the Valkyries. And so, as a experiment, people set a whole bunch of different pieces to that same scene. And in fact, all you're doing is watching a helicopter go by. So if you're listening to, say, Eine kleine Nacht music, that's very different from Ride of the Valkyries. And that's the power that a film score has on us. I can't really imagine Star Wars without John Williams' epic score, or Jaws, or maybe going back to Lawrence of Arabia or Dr. Zhivago. Nina Rota, Godfather. These are just great, great scores. And in classical music, a lot of well-known composers have written for film, like Leonard Bernstein, like, actually more recently, Philip Glass wrote a film score. And so there was, or has been, some crossover. So William Walton, who lived from 1902 to 1983, he actually wrote music, concert music. We know his viola concerto. He wrote 2 symphonies. He wrote stage music, opera, ballet, and 13 film scores. So, yeah, there's the crossover for you right there. So what I like in this suite is that there are 5 very beautiful and contrasting pieces. And he thinks about the style of English early music. So, for example, the first movement, which is an overture, harkens back to English Renaissance music and earlier. It's modal. It uses percussion the way you would expect it to. And it's quite fun and effective. Then the second and the fourth movements are for strings alone. One of them is kind of somber. One of them is kind of more of a love song. And I think Leonard Slatkin actually has used the fourth movement of this suite as somewhere in his programming, perhaps as an encore or in other occasions. So you might be familiar with the fourth movement. The third movement has been described by critics kind of as the highlight of this suite. It is the music for the battle scene. And so there's a great build-up, and you can kind of hear and through the music and visualize the knights charging into battle. And then the last movement is a celebration called the Agincourt Song. And of course, Henry V was a war king, and the play, this play celebrates his surprising victory during the 100 Years' War near the French city of Azincourt, I think is how it's said, or Azincourt. And they were outnumbered by maybe, 3-1. And they ended up having a decisive victory over the French while only losing several hundred men. So that's the whole point of this play. And the music is a great illustration of these characters and affects. And I think you can, I've never actually seen this movie, but, and William Walton is quoted as saying that he didn't think that film music should be played without the film. But he's dead, so so this suite was done after his death. In the original film score, there's also chorus in some of these numbers, but I happen to disagree with him. I think the music is quite powerful and very descriptive. So it's a very fun opener. It's something that we might not have heard, certainly not in a concert hall. So it's a great way to open the program. And the conductor this week, Ben Glassberg, is a very young conductor from the UK. So this is actually his US debut, is this weekend's concerts with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So, let's go on to our kind of meat and potatoes on the first half, which is Tchaikovsky's second piano concerto. So, it's a real beast of a piece, in that in scope, it lasts, I think, over 40 minutes. And I was trying to think about other concerti that are so massive. And of course, Brahms' second piano concerto comes to mind. Elgar's violin concerto is just about that long. And our pianist this week, Kiril Gerstein, who's perhaps one of the most incredible pianists of our generation, he actually recently released a recording with the Boston Symphony Orchestra of the Busoni piano concerto, which takes about 70 minutes to play. So it's on the scale of a epic Mahler symphony with piano solo. So I guess he likes playing long pieces. Yeah, last week he premiered, or very recently he premiered Thomas Addis's new piano concerto, which apparently is a mere 24 minutes. And Kiril said, that's the perfect length. And you think about the history of concerti and the Mozart piano concertos. Of course, some of the Beethoven piano concertos, the Emperor kind of approaches that length, but a lot of them are between the 25 to 30-minute mark. So this is a real, make sure you go to the bathroom before the first half. It is grand in a couple other ways. So I think Tchaikovsky, when he started to write this in 1879, he wrote it between 1879 and 80, he was looking for a piece for himself. There wasn't a commission out there for a piano concerto, so this is him expressing himself and kind of exploring what he can do within the nature of a concerto and a dialogue between piano and orchestra. He's actually quoted as saying something to the effect that he didn't actually like the way that the piano sounded with orchestra. So what you see in the first movement is actually a lot of times the piano playing by itself and then in dialogue with the orchestra, which is kind of an older style of concerto grosso attitude. The cadenza, well, there's several cadenzas in the first movement, but the main cadenza for the piano, I think, lasts about 8 minutes long. And there's a lot of people sitting on stage listening to some amazing piano playing. So it's a really special kind of piece for this scale. There's other things that he's experimenting with in this piece. He had just finished, I think about a year or so earlier, his incredible opera, Eugene Onegin. And there are some moments that sound so operatic. The piece actually opens with this march figure, but then it's going, and then all of a sudden there's a full stop. And then the orchestra strings come in on this tremolo kind of chord, and out of nowhere, the clarinet has basically an opera aria. It sounds like it comes out of Verdi. And then the piano takes over and develops it and takes it to places we don't expect. But we don't expect that in a piano concerto. So Tchaikovsky is very experimental. The second movement is incredible and incredibly strange. Maybe I should say it's interesting, but I'm worried sometimes when I say something is interesting, it's like going to the doctor. You don't want to hear the doctor say, wow, that's interesting. So in the second movement, Kiril will sit there for quite a few minutes while our concertmaster Kim this week has an enormous violin solo. And then when that's wrapping up, you think maybe the piano will play now, but no, then the cello has an enormous solo. And in fact, there's going to be a chair and a stand set up there, so Wei Yu, the principal cello, will come over here, and they're going to form a little trio over here. Because for the second movement, it's as if you've stepped into another world and you've entered some kind of triple concerto world, which doesn't belong here at all. And it's incredible. Now, some people didn't think it was incredible. Most of the critics panned it. When it was premiered in New York, I should have written down what the New York Times said. It was basically, this concerto has nothing useful to say. That's kind of what they said. Of course, this happens with many premieres, so we don't have to take too much stock in that. But one of Tchaikovsky's students, a man by the name of Silotti, went ahead and sliced and diced this concerto, eliminated all of those bits for the violin and cello, and created some kind of shorter version of this concerto, which became the version that people performed until, I wrote it down, 1949. And in 1949, people went back to the original score and said, okay, maybe structurally it can be a little long-winded, but this is still authentic Tchaikovsky, so it's better than cutting it up and doing some kind of piecemeal thing. So the trip that you take through these statements is part of what Tchaikovsky's going for. I'll return to that in just one second, but I'll just say that the third movement is very different from the first two movements, and it sounds kind of like, I don't know, I think of it like a country dance, and it's very lively, it's very fun, it harkens back to kind of a rondo form of the last movement that's lively and silly, and you don't have to invest too much of, the angst has already happened, and so now you just sit back and it's a party. There's also a little line in there, which, sorry, I hope I don't ruin it for you, but it sounds just like Woody the Woodpecker for me. It's like, da-da-dun-dun, da-da-dun-dun. I mean, really? You wonder where he got that from. Woody the Woodpecker. I don't think Tchaikovsky knew of Woody the Woodpecker. In the first movement, there's this D major cadences that sound just like the Alleluia chorus. That probably Tchaikovsky knew. Maybe there was a reference in there. We don't know. So what exactly else to me is really striking about this piece is how different it is from the first piano concerto and how different it is from other things he was writing around this time. So, for example, in 1877, his Fourth Symphony in the Rococo variations. Just after he wrote this piece, in 1880, is the famous Romeo and Juliet overture fantasy, is the Capriccio Italien, and 1812. And one of the things that I think unify all of those pieces and is what we have in mind when we think of Tchaikovsky is as a gifted melodist. You think about the ballet scores, which you hear Nutcracker once in December, and it takes you to like November the next year to get it out of your head. Especially if you're a musician, you have to play it 27 times. This piece is not like that. It's incredible in its sonority. It's incredible in the demands of technique and sound necessary from the piano. But you don't have those soaring lines and long melodies that you think of from Tchaikovsky. So you can sit back and think maybe this is his response to the Wagnerians out there. This kind of wealth of sound and evolving keys and just gorgeous things happening, but not necessarily a tune that you'll go home to sing. And I think that that's one of the reasons why critics didn't quite understand it. I don't know if it was ahead of its time. I don't know if its time is now. I just think that it's really beautiful music. And you need somebody who's extremely convincing in the interpretation, and we have that with Kiril, which even from the very first phrase is colored and shaped and sounds amazing. So it's a special concerto. It's one of these things that you see Tchaikovsky, you think you know what you're expecting, but I'm not so sure. I think it's not what we're used to when we think about a Tchaikovsky work. Actually, even his violin concerto was just a few years earlier, and of course that's so rich in melodies, right? So that's our grand first half. And then on the second half, we are visiting or playing a work written about 10 years after the Tchaikovsky concerto, and that's Dvořák's Eighth Symphony. He was, I think we always have to think of Dvořák in a couple of ways. One is a lot of his talent was through his own development and his kind of self-taught method. So there's a lot of just raw musical ideas that come at us. Extremely gifted melodist as well, just like Tchaikovsky. The other thing that I think is important, especially in a context like this Eighth Symphony, which is mostly a very sunny work, but it starts in a somber mood, and there are these melancholy overtones or hints throughout, like in the third movement. And I think that a lot of what drives this for Dvořák is that early on in his marriage, he had 3 children within a few years, and all 3 of them died at a very young age. His first son died, I think, by age 3. His second child was a daughter who lived something like 2 days. And then he had another daughter who lived 1 year. And so there's, okay, fine, we know infant mortality has come a long way in 150 years. But that has to stay with you. And so when I hear these kind of sounds from Dvořák, I always think about, what was he able to be fully happy? So that being said, the second movement for this symphony, for example, has some strains of a funeral march, and then some very beautiful moments. The last movement is a set of very rough variations in a kind of nationalistic Czech flavor. And what we see with Dvořák is this strong sense of self and his own sound, and also a deep identity with his roots in what is now the Czech Republic, in Prague, and this Slavonic or Slavic sound. He wrote a series of works on dance themes, the Slavonic dances. His symphonies have some of these hallmark rhythms. And, clearly he was always searching for some kind of national identity. For example, the symphony he wrote after this symphony, a couple years later, when he came to America, we all know it, the Ninth Symphony, From a New World, he was looking for the American sound there. And what should the American symphonic world be? So when I listen to Dvořák, I'm always listening for these kind of, roots and happiness tinged with this underlying sadness somewhere behind that. The Eighth Symphony is, interestingly, very different from his previous symphony, which he wrote about 4 years earlier, which is also an incredible work. I don't think we perform it quite often enough. It's very Brahmsian in its scale and scope. If you don't know it, thankfully the internet has many ways that you can play it and find it. So don't just think about Dvořák as his 8th and 9th symphony. Listen to his 7th symphony, listen to his 6th symphony. When we go earlier, we don't know them as well. They're a little bit less polished works. But he's an often performed composer, but I still think he's quite underrated as a composer because he has so much natural talent. In this symphony, I also am a composer, have studied composition. Of course, I study scores as a conductor. And one thing you can contrast tonight, if you think about it while you're listening, is a concept of transition in material. This is perhaps a bit of a compositional thing, but Tchaikovsky connects his threads very often with transitions, sometimes quite long-winded transitions, as he's modulating from one key area to another. Dvořák kind of just gives you the idea, then gives you the next idea, then gives you the next idea, and the transition is simply the new material, the new material, the new material. And he's got such creative ideas, and of course, his voice is still his voice. So even though you get so many ideas thrown at you, the overall unity of sound and inspiration creates the shape of the work. So I think that's just, if you find yourself thinking, well, nothing's happened right now for a couple minutes in Tchaikovsky, maybe he's just meandering from one section to another, and I doubt you'll experience that in the Dvořák work. The other thing that you can think about if you're looking at the whole program is kind of these nationalistic ideas, that William Walton really was looking for an English sound as an English composer, of course, but also because he was writing music for Shakespeare. So how more English can you get? Tchaikovsky is synonymous for us now with the Russian school, the Russian sound. For Russian composers, I think that the second symphony, it's almost like a second symphony. The second concerto is kind of like Brahms' second concerto. I think Rachmaninoff, follows the trajectory set forth by Tchaikovsky. And then, of course, Dvořák with his own nationalistic flair. Okay, so, sorry I kept on talking for so long. I want to leave about 5 minutes here for questions that you might have about our program or about some other random things that are in your mind, about Star Wars, about Beethoven. I can tell a funny story about Beethoven. So this morning, I was driving in the car, and I have this CD playing called Beethoven Lives Upstairs, which is, you know, a kid's program, and that tells a story, and there's a protagonist, a nephew, and his uncle, and they keep on talking about a guy called Mr. Beethoven. And so my son, who's 4, and he's very specific, 4 3/4, said to me, "Papa, have you conducted Mr. Beethoven?" That was super cute. I was like, yes, I thankfully have had the privilege of conducting Mr. Beethoven's music. I've had the privilege of conducting Dvořák 8, and I've known Kiril for over 20 years now, and we haven't had a chance to work together, but he's just an incredible, incredible musician. So in terms of the program, and in terms of the artist and soloist, I think you're in for a treat. So, are there any? Yes, please.
Who chose the second piano?
The question is, who chose the second piano concerto? Tchaikovsky, clearly. No. That's a programming question that comes into play quite often. How do our programs in general get designed? And it's usually a dialogue between the artistic administrators, Eric Ronmark, the soloist, the manager, about a soloist like Kiril is probably booked a few years in advance. So first they're going to find the soloist, and then they'll say, well, what's he playing that year? Or what's he interested in, or she interested in playing? And then maybe they'll look at the whole season and say, well, this season we're already playing Tchaikovsky 1, so I don't think we'll do another Tchaikovsky concerto. But we're not playing Tchaik 1, so maybe he suggests Tchaik 2, and maybe the administration says, well, look, we're not doing any Tchaik concertos this year, and in fact, we haven't done it in 15 years, and it's a great work that we think that our audience should hear. Okay, so let's put that. Okay, then who's the conductor? And then they find the conductor, and then the conductor could say, well, if Tchaikovsky 2 is on the first half, I think Dvořák 8 would be a great piece to go with it, and so on and so forth. So usually it's a dialogue that goes between the soloist and the administration, and of course the soloist has a big voice in picking what repertoire they would like to perform. Who picked this one? Oh, I actually don't know where it ended. You're not a fan, I take it. Oh, you are a fan. Good. All right. Somebody came. You drove all the way from Pittsburgh to hear it. Thank you for coming. Flew. Good. Okay. That's amazing, because it's not a piece that you're going to hear very often live, and so it is a special occasion. It's interesting always to, you know, when you have a composer like Tchaikovsky, and yet in some ways tonight may as well be a world premiere for many of us. Thank you so much for being here, for supporting our orchestra, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.